Good morning. It's Monday, August 9th, and we are back. 2021. And we're back reading about 10 minutes a day from the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice. Today is episode 74, and we are reading, beginning on page 290, and we are reading from Murray Rothbard, Anatomy of the State, 1974. So let's start reading about halfway down on page 290. Here we go. Another tried and true method for bending subjects to the state's will is inducing guilt. Any increase in private well-being can be attacked as, quote, unconscionable greed, quote, materialism, or, quote, excessive affluence. Profit-making can be attacked as, quote, exploitation and, quote, usury. Mutually beneficial exchanges denounced as, quote, selfishness, and somehow with the conclusion always being drawn that more resources should be siphoned from private to the, quote, public sector. The induced guilt makes the public more ready to do just that. For while individual persons tend to indulge in, quote, selfish greed, the failure of the state's rulers to engage in exchanges is supposed to signify their devotion to higher and nobler causes. Parasitic predation being apparently morally and aesthetically lofty as compared to peaceful and productive work. In the present, more secular age, the divine right of the state has been supplemented by the invocation of a new god, science. State rule is now proclaimed as being ultra-scientific, as constituting planning by experts. But while, quote, reason is invoked more than in previous centuries, this is not the true reason of the individual and his exercise of free will. It is still collectivist and determinist, still implying holistic aggregates and coercive manipulation of passive subjects by their rulers. The increasing use of scientific jargon has permitted the state's intellectuals to weave obscurantist apologia. I'm not even sure how to pronounce that. Obscurist apologia for state rule that would have only met with the derision by the populace of a simpler age. A robber who justified his theft by saying that he really helped his victims by his spending giving a boost to retail trade would find few converts, but when this theory is clothed in Keynesian equations and impressive references to the, quote, multiplier effect, it unfortunately carries more conviction. And so the assault on common sense proceeds, each age performing the task in its own ways. Thus, ideological support being vital to the state, it must unceasingly try to impress the public with its, quote, legitimacy. To distinguish its activities from those of mere brigands, the unremitting determination of its assaults on common sense is no accident. For as Mencken vividly maintained, and this is a whole piece by Mencken that's subquoted in this piece by Rothbard, the average man, whatever his errors otherwise, at least sees clearly the government is something lying outside him and outside the generality of his fellow men. That it is a separate, independent, and hostile power only partly under his control and capable of doing him great harm. Is it a fact of no significance that robbing the government is everywhere regarded as a crime of less magnitude than robbing an individual or even a corporation? What lies behind all this, I believe, is a deep sense of the fundamental antagonism between the government and the people it governs. It is apprehended not as a committee of citizens chosen to carry on the communal business of the whole population, but as a separate and autonomous corporation, mainly devoted to exploiting the population for the benefit of its own members. When a private citizen is robbed, a worthy man is deprived of the fruits of his industry and thrift. When the government is robbed, the worst that happens is that certain rogues and loafers have less money to play with than they had before. The notion that they have earned that money is never entertained. To most sensible men, it would seem ludicrous. The next section of the essay by Rothbard. How the state transcends its limits. As Bertrand de Jouvenel has sagely pointed out, through the centuries, men have formed concepts designed to check and limit the exercise of state rule. And one after another, the state, using its intellectual allies, has been able to transform these concepts into intellectual rubber stamps of legitimacy and virtue to attach to its decrees and actions. Originally, in Western Europe, the concept of divine sovereignty held that the kings may rule only according to divine law. The kings turned the concept into a rubber stamp of divine approval for any of the king's actions. The concept of parliamentary democracy began as a popular check upon absolute monarchical rule. It ended with Parliament being the essential part of the state and its every action totally sovereign. As de Jouvenel concludes, quote, many writers on theories of sovereignty have worked out one of these restrictive devices. But in the end, every single such theory has, sooner or later, lost its original purpose and come to act merely as a springboard to power, by providing it with the powerful aid of an invisible sovereign with whom it could, in time, successfully identify itself. End quote. Similarly, with more specific doctrines, the, quote, natural rights of the individual enshrined in John Locke in the Bill of Rights became a statist, quote, right to a job. Utilitarianism turned from arguments for liberty to arguments against resisting the state's invasions of liberty, etc. Certainly the most ambitious attempt to impose limits on the state has been the Bill of Rights and other restrictive parts of the American Constitution, in which written limits on government became the fundamental law to be interpreted by a judiciary supposedly independent of the other branches of government. All Americans are familiar with the process by which the construction of limits in the Constitution has been inexorably broadened over the last century. But few have been as keen as Professor Charles Black to see that the state has, in the process, largely transformed judicial review itself from a limiting device to yet another instrument for furnishing ideological legitimacy to the government's actions. For if a judicial decree of, quote, unconstitutional is a mighty check to government power, an implicit or explicit verdict of, quote, constitutional is a mighty weapon for fostering public acceptance of ever greater government power. Professor Black begins his analysis by pointing out the crucial necessity of, quote, legitimacy for any government to endure. This legitimation signifying basic majority acceptance of the government and its actions. Acceptance of legitimacy becomes a particular problem in a country such as the United States, where, quote, substantive limitations are built into the theory on which the government rests, end quote. What is needed, adds Black, is a means by which the government can assure the public that its increasing powers are indeed, quote, constitutional. And this, he concludes, has been the major historic function of judicial review. Let Black illustrate the problem. Quote, the supreme risk to the government is that of disaffection and a feeling of outrage widely disseminated throughout the population, and loss of moral authority by the government as such, however long it may be propped up by force or inertia, or the lack of an appealing and immediately available alternative. Almost everybody living under a government of limited powers must sooner or later be subjected to some governmental action, which, as a matter of private opinion, he regards as outside the power of government or positively forbidden to government. A man is drafted, though he finds nothing in the Constitution about being drafted. A farmer is told how much wheat he can raise. He believes, and he discovers, that some respectable lawyers believe with him that the government has no more right to tell him how much wheat he can grow than it has to tell his daughter whom she can marry. A man goes to the federal penitentiary for saying what he wants to, and he paces his cell reciting, quote, Congress shall make no laws abridging the freedom of speech, end quote. A businessman is told what he can ask and must ask for buttermilk. And that's the end of Black's illustration. The danger is real enough that each of these people, and who is not of their number, will confront the concept of governmental limitation with the reality as he sees it of the flagrant overstepping of actual limits, and draw the obvious conclusion as to the status of his government with respect to legitimacy. And we'll go ahead and stop right there so you can linger on that thought about violations of these basic constitutional things causing people to question the government's legitimacy. We would not want that because the government is absolutely legitimate and just trying to protect us. And we'll leave it there at the bottom of 293, where we'll get back tomorrow with about 10 minutes a day reading the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice.